You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 101. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so glad to have you here with me today, celebrating triple digits still. Yes, I like to really extend the celebration of hitting these milestones. And thank you for coming along for the ride. I hope that wherever you are having a fabulous week. And thank you for coming to join me to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is procrastination. Now, today's episode is inspired by a talk that I gave yesterday evening. I was invited by the Advocates Society here in Vancouver, BC, to speak at an in-person event. And the topic was time management and executive functioning and how those two match, how they fit together in a legal practice. And it was amazing. It was such an honor to be invited. There were about 30 guests, a mix of lawyers and accountants, and they were the most wonderful audience. I can still see their faces in my mind's eye. They were engaged. They asked questions. They shared their takeaways at the end of the session. It was such a fun night. And for any of you who have listened to my podcast before, you probably know that I am such a fan of all things time management and executive function. There's a whole series that I did a few months ago now, episodes 86 to 89, that are all about the relationship between executive function and time management in a legal practice. So if this topic resonates with you, you can always go back to those episodes. That was really the foundation of what we spoke about last night. We talked about time management. We talked about task initiation, procrastination, task completion, so maintaining focus. And the discussion was so interesting. And one of the guests at the event asked a question about procrastinating in relation to a situation that comes up in their practice. What do you do when? And I'm not going to share with you their exact scenario. What I am going to ask of you is to think about in your practice where you find that you often procrastinate. And so some examples might be when you sit down to draft an argument, you might find that you freeze up and you push that task off. It might be doing your billable hours at the end of the day or throughout the day, you procrastinate on doing that task. It may be that you've got a stack of letters that you need to review and you just don't want to review them. You let them sit. And it may be some other task that is something that features regularly in your practice that you chronically push off. You may also find that outside of work, there are areas where you procrastinate. Maybe it's setting doctor's appointments, or maybe you're like me and you need to sign your kids up for summer camp, and that just keeps getting pushed to the bottom of your to-do list. What I'd invite you to think about for the purpose of today's episode is to think about where you are procrastinating and what that might be telling you. That is at the heart of today's episode, not just tips and tricks and strategies to overcome that energy block when you sit down to work on a task, but to look at procrastination and ask yourself, what is this procrastination trying to tell you? Now, it may be that procrastination isn't trying to tell you anything. It might just be that you're a human and you procrastinate. We all do. We are motivated to pursue pleasure, avoid pain, and exert the least amount of energy possible. That's how we were designed. So if you need to sit down and focus and jump into a large task, it's not surprising that you may procrastinate. And if one thing was clear at yesterday's event, it was how much everyone appreciated being in a room where we were talking about procrastination, talking about how it's a function of your executive functions and how there's tips and tricks and strategies that you can use to overcome that inertia, to initiate the task, and how it is not something to be ashamed of. It is not something, if you do it, that you're the only one who does it. So there was a lot of comfort in knowing that this is a very, very common challenge for lawyers, for accountants, for all of us humans with human brains and executive functioning skills, where we may not leap into tasks that we do not want to do. So that was one thing that came out that was very apparent. But this question that was posed was one that must have rested in the back of my mind, because this morning when I woke up, I thought, okay, I answered that question at a surface level. We were talking about strategies to overcome procrastination, the two main strategies being to leverage your task initiation function, particularly by chopping large projects into small pieces and then finding ways to initiate those tasks, whether it's setting a timer for yourself, whether it's picking one thing and doing it first. The other main strategy being emotional regulation. So looking at the emotion that you feel in relation to the task, whether it's boredom, dread, fear, anxiety, it could be a whole host of emotions. And then looking at the thoughts that are creating those emotions for you and finding a way to reframe those thoughts. So those were the two main strategies that I was offering in relation to procrastination. And so the answer that I gave in the moment was really focused on those two strategies. And what I came to realize this morning, I was out for my run and I thought, there's another way to look at that question, which is to step back and ask, if this is a situation that comes up frequently at work where you are procrastinating, yes, you might be able to motivate yourself through using tips and strategies, but maybe there's a bigger picture problem there that requires closer examination. And so today, what I want to talk about is that bigger picture problem. So the issue here isn't that it's a problem that you procrastinate. The question here is, are you chronically procrastinating on something in some area? And what does that mean? So this exists. Procrastination is totally normal, but sometimes you'll start to procrastinate more, and it's a sign that something else is going on. And you may try to solve the problem by using strategies like we were talking about yesterday, right? Some strategies that can help you leverage your executive function to initiate tasks. But if you continue to try to do that, what you might find is that you're offering a band-aid solution to something that is a greater problem. And what you might create there is frustration because you keep coming up against the same type of work, the same situation where you're procrastinating. You might continue to procrastinate, and the real problem, the underlying problem, doesn't get resolved. And so what I want to offer today is to give you some questions, a bit of a framework that you can use to identify where the procrastination is and what it might signal. Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? And then what you can do about it. So the first thing that I'd like to offer you is to assess where you fall on the spectrum. So if you accept that procrastination is a normal part of any aspect in your life, I was going to say of your practice, but really we procrastinate on all sorts of things. So yes, let's accept that you're going to procrastinate on some elements of your practice. First of all, where are you procrastinating? So I've asked you already to identify areas where you procrastinate. And as we're talking through today's podcast episode, maybe more examples are coming to mind for you. But look at where you're procrastinating and then ask yourself what portion of your practice, how much of it involves work where you procrastinate, whether it's out of dread or boredom or fear or whatever feelings are connected to that perfectionism. How much of your day is spent procrastinating? And it helps, I think, to give yourself a scale, whether it's a percentage of time, maybe it's 25% of your time, maybe it's 75% of your time, maybe it's a question of degree. Maybe you find that the level of procrastination overall is maybe a 3, which is fine. Maybe it's a 9, which maybe not be sustainable. So give yourself a way of thinking about procrastination. I think the percentage is probably a good measure here. What percentage of time do you spend procrastinating in your practice, or what tasks or projects do you find you procrastinate a lot on? And that's really the starting point. Because that leads us to the next question, which is whether procrastination is a problem you need to solve, or is it a problem that you need to manage? And there's an episode that I recorded a few weeks back. It's episode 79. And I believe the title is Problems You Solve versus Problems You Manage. And this is a concept that I did not create myself. It's one that was coined by John Gottman, who is a relationship specialist. He has a whole Gottman Institute, and he talks about it in the context of marriage. And in a marriage, what he says is that there are problems that, well, first of all, marriages, I think some crazy percent, I think it's 60% of relationships or 60% of problems in a marriage are ones that they're not solvable. They're not solvable problems. And so they're no longer problems that you need to solve. They're problems that you manage. And you get to decide if those are problems that are sufficient to, say, break up a marriage, or if you want to stay in the marriage, but work on those problems. And I would offer that you can think of your career the same way. As long as you are engaged in professional work, you're going to have a relationship with it, much like a marriage. You're committed, and not everything is going to go exactly the way that you want. There are not going to be all tasks that are 100% you want to jump right in. There's no procrastination. And so the question here then becomes, is it a problem you solve or a problem that you manage? So let's say you're a litigator and you get really nervous going to court. And you might look at what percentage of your practice that is. You might look at the level of procrastination that is involved when you have court applications that you're preparing for. And you might say to yourself, okay, this reaches a level of discomfort that I just don't want to experience anymore. Maybe litigation is not for me. Or you might say, the percentage isn't great. I don't love it, but I love what I'm doing, my work as a litigator. It's really important to me. So this is going to be a problem that I'm going to choose to manage. So you can see the difference there, right? You can see how you're now looking at your practice. You're looking at where you're procrastinating, and you're deciding, is this something that I need to solve? Do I want to solve it? Or is this a problem that I can manage? So look at that for you. Think about the areas where you're procrastinating. Think about how much time that is taking away from your practice, and ask yourself, is this a problem that you want to solve? Is it a problem that you want to manage? If you want to manage it, maybe you go back to that podcast episodes, and that might give you some ideas on how to manage a problem when you're not planning to actually solve it, where you cannot solve it. And if it's a problem that you find you don't want to manage, right? This has kind of reached a point where the threshold level is greater. This is causing discomfort in a more chronic way. That is where we go to that next step and look at what some of those problems might be for you. So here, I'm going to offer you some ideas, some areas where I have seen lawyers get a little bit tripped up over procrastination, where there may be slippage from that problem you manage into problem that you need to solve. And so I've got 6 of them actually listed out here. This is not an exhaustive list, but I want to jog your ideas. I want to help you, encourage you to think about some of the challenges that you may be facing if you've got this chronic procrastination going on. So number 1 is you may find that your procrastination because of the nature of your work. So for example, you may be a family law lawyer and your practice is really high conflict, and yet you do not enjoy conflict. You have a very difficult time managing that in your practice. You might be a corporate solicitor, and where you are right now, you're acting for very large organizations. But in your heart of hearts, what you really want is to be working side by side with startups and entrepreneurs. It may be that you no longer feel aligned with your legal practice. It may also be that you have outgrown your role. So here, going back to this procrastination, is that you may find that, yes, there are tasks that you don't like to do in your practice, and that's one thing. But when you find that you're chronically wanting to procrastinate, that it's really requiring a lot of you to even initiate the tasks, it may be that there's a question of alignment. And the solution here is not necessarily to try new strategies to initiate the task and get things done. This, I think, requires a much deeper dive into evaluating what the container is for your professional work. What are your goals? What are your values? What do you want to accomplish throughout the course of your career? And I've recorded a podcast episode about legacy, and you can go back to that episode because it has some powerful questions about what you want to create over the course of your career. And so I'd invite you to think about that. Where are you wanting to go with your career? Get those goals clear. And then you can start looking at the tasks that are leading to procrastination. And you can ask yourself whether or not there's an alignment issue. Because if they're not aligned, then that means that you may need to make some changes where you are right now. It may mean that you need to make some changes into a different role. So that's number one area where you might be procrastinating, where the issue isn't so much, how can I overcome this by changing my thoughts about it or implementing some strategies? It's a question of taking a step back and saying, am I aligned? And do I need to realign myself? Do I need to change the nature of my work? So another area where I would invite you to consider if this is something that's happening for you would be burnout. Now, in yesterday's session, some of the attendees were accountants, and currently it is tax season. And so one of our guests mentioned that she was procrastinating in a context of being in the middle of tax season and it being harder to get started on tasks. So what I'd invite you to think about here is, in that moment of procrastination, how are you feeling? Now, one of the tips that I offer when it comes to time management, particularly with procrastination or staying focused on a task, is to evaluate how you're actually feeling, what your physical health and mental health are in the moment. Have you had enough sleep? Have you had enough to eat? Have you had coffee if that's what you need to get started in the morning? Are you rested, right? These are some of the basic elements that are required for you to function at your highest level. Now, this is fine if you're on a schedule where you've been able to do all of that. But in a legal practice and in an accountant's practice and other professionals, there may be seasons where the level of professional work required of you is greater than would allow you for your optimal sleep, self-care, all of that. And sometimes it is seasonal, like a tax season. If you're a litigator, you might have a trial or a court application you're preparing for. If you're a solicitor, you might have a deal, you might have a closing, you might have tax season where your clients are particularly active. And so there's an ebb and flow to your practice. And if you're in a flow period, yes, you might feel like you're getting a bit burnt out, but you're not necessarily in that state of chronic burnout. If you are in that first category, right, it's a cyclical thing and you know that you're going to recover from it, then maybe that burnout, maybe that procrastination is something that you kind of work your way through. You take the best care of yourself that you can in the moment. And then when the flow turns to ebb, you recalibrate, you rejuvenate, all of that. But if what you're finding is that you're at this high level, you're at this state where you're chronically working in a way that you're no longer able to take care of yourself in the way that you need to in order to be able to approach your work with some level of enthusiasm and vigor, then maybe it's a sign that there's something else going on there. And it could be that you're in the road or on the road to burnout. And so what I'd invite you to do, if that is something that you can relate to, is to think about what that means for you. Does it mean that you need to set boundaries around what you are taking on? Does it mean that you need to reevaluate the practice that you're in? Are you in a practice where this is just how it is and either you go along with it or you find a different practice? So there may be some soul searching that is required there, but what you're solving for isn't how do I initiate my task in the moment? It is how do I set myself up in a practice where I don't need to rely so much on these strategies to get started? What I really want to do here is recalibrate, reorient myself so that I'm not feeling on the verge of burnout throughout the course of the day. The next one is an example that I hear from clients sometimes, which is this idea of being instructed to do things that they do not want to do. Now, I think you can parse this into two different categories. Sometimes it's volume, right? You may have internal or external clients where the volume of work that is assigned to you is at a pace that just is, again, not sustainable. So we're sort of talking about the burnout piece as well. There may be some overlap here. And what you may find is that there's so much on your plate that you feel overwhelmed. You don't know where to start. It feels futile. It's frustrating. And sometimes what you might find is that your clients are asking you to do things that you don't actually want to do. These may be instructions that you do not want to execute, whether it's an argument that you think is bound to fail, whether it's a conversation with opposing counsel that you do not want to have, whether it's taking an unreasonable position. And so here you may need to ask yourself whether there are boundaries questions that are at play. It may involve an ethical question. Do you feel like, are these decisions that you may want to seek advice on? And so what I invite you to do here is to ask yourself if what you're finding is that there's a disconnect between what you're being asked to do and what you truly want to do. There may be, yes, an element of procrastination. You don't want to get started on that task, but is there a bigger picture question here for you to explore that revolves around boundaries and the nature of your work and what you're being asked to do? And again, these categories are not airtight, so that alignment question might also play in here. You're being instructed to do work that no longer feels aligned to you. And so again, you're wanting to go back and say, where does this fit into the bigger picture? And part of the reason that this, I think, is really important, obviously you want to be doing work that aligns with your bigger goals and your aspirations, how you want to serve, how you want to contribute. But what you might find is if you try to use strategies to overcome procrastination, right? You're breaking up your task into small pieces, you're setting a timer, you're getting started. That works so much better when you can see the purpose behind the task that you're doing versus when you see the work that you're doing as being out of alignment with your greater goals. So this is really important. The fourth category where you might want to explore what is going on behind the procrastination is the notion of self-confidence. And often we procrastinate because there's an element of fear. There might be an element of self-doubt. There might be an element of perfectionism, not wanting to get started on something because we don't think we're going to be able to do it perfectly. And so we put it off. And ironically, we end up not giving ourselves enough time to do the job as well as we could have done it had we given ourselves the time to do the first draft, to refine the first draft, all of it. So if this is something that's coming up chronically, I mean, there may be times in your practice where, yes, you feel a little bit in water that's over your head. The expression is escaping me, but you may find that, yes, there are moments where you're really challenged, where you're really pushed. And that may be part of your growth, being in those situations where it's uncomfortable, but you rise to the challenge, you learn, you grow, and you move forward. So that might be a more situational or seasonal, if you will, situation where, yes, you are going to procrastinate because of these things. But if you're finding that your practice is really slowed down because there's this ongoing narrative where you're underestimating yourself, you're undermining yourself, you've got a really negative internal self-talk, and you're finding you're exhausting yourself, you're paralyzed from moving forward in your work, then the solution may be that we need to really focus on your confidence and building that confidence that you have within yourself. It may also mean looking at the relationship that you have with yourself. Do you trust yourself? Have you built that relationship? And it may mean that what we really want to do is focus on that. And when you solve for that problem, then the procrastination problem falls away or it lessens. And so that's another example where procrastination may be a messenger for something deeper that's going on. I've got two more examples. So just to recap, we've talked about the nature of the work and are you aligned with it? We've talked about burnout and whether what you're experiencing is fatigue in a situational situation or more of a ongoing situation. We've talked about where what you're being asked to do may not align, whether it's the thing, the task, whether you don't agree with it, whether there's just too much of it. We've talked about self-confidence. So is it an issue of confidence? The next area where you might find you procrastinate is because of money mindset. I have talked to so many lawyers who struggle with billing, whether it is setting out the time on their timesheets, whether it's the actual act of invoicing the client, whether it's creating estimates up front. And at issue here is your relationship with money, your relationship with your client, your thoughts and beliefs about your client's relationship with money, their views on money, their views on you, their estimation of the value that you're bringing to the equation. And so this is a mix of self-confidence and social programming about money. And what might happen here is you might feel guilty. You might feel guilty because you think you shouldn't be recording all this time. You shouldn't be charging your client all this money. You might feel that you haven't provided the value. You might dread that your client will be upset, that they will see the invoice and they will be upset, and maybe they will be. And maybe there hasn't been a framework set up with the client, an expectation set with the client so that they know what to expect, what you expect there to be in terms of a fee estimate. And this really does go deep into self-esteem and self-value. I think sometimes we can look at a project. If you've ever been asked to do an estimate on a file, you know how hard that is to say ahead of time. I used to do it for litigation mandates, and we used to have to give a really broad range in terms of what the budget was, because you don't know going into a file whether you're going to have opposing counsel who want to move matters forward quickly or if they're going to fight you every step of the way. You don't know maybe at the beginning how many documents you're going to need to review. You don't know how many witnesses you're going to need to discover. So there's a lot of unknowns. And when you are giving a client an estimate, it might feel really uncomfortable because you look at the number of hours that are required, you look at the estimate for the amount of money that is involved. And if you're working particularly with individuals, you might find that it's really hard to communicate that to the client. And so you might avoid doing that. You might shy away from those conversations. You might kind of avoid them. And unfortunately, what happens then is that, yes, that is where you might get into mismatched expectations. And there are rules in the Code of Conduct. There are certainly in British Columbia and other Canadian provinces about relationships that you have with your clients and with money. And so wherever you are, whatever jurisdiction you're practicing in, if this is something that is relevant to you, then I'd encourage you to go and look at what the rules are when it comes to talking to your clients about money. But this is a real problem area for a lot of lawyers. So you might call it money mindset. What I see this as is if you want to break it down into categories, it's looking at your relationship with money. So what are the beliefs that you have about money? How have you been conditioned to think about money? It's looking at the relationship you have with yourself as a service provider who is charging money to your clients, and also to think about your relationship with your clients and their views on money and how you want to deal with situations where you need to have conversations that are potentially difficult for you to have. So if this is an area where you're procrastinating, it may be that yes, you're procrastinating on actually doing the invoices, actually recording your time. It may be a sign of a deeper problem and one that you can solve by doing that exploration work and coming to resolutions and creating protocols for yourself in terms of how you want to move forward. So that was number 5. Number 6 is to look at, if you're procrastinating, and this is kind of a different flavor, but this is more looking at practice management. So I've had lawyers, a number of them, who put off certain things in their practice because they don't want to see the reality of what's happening in their practice. So a really good example of this is putting down your hours on your timesheet. Sometimes you might spend your entire day at the office, and yet when you go to record your time on your timesheet, you've got, 3.0, 3.2, or some number of hours. And it doesn't reflect the level of effort or exertion or value that you have contributed that day. And it may be a sign of systems that are not working all that great. It may be that there are efficiencies that you could create in your practice. It could be that you're simply not capturing all your time. You're not having a way of recording the time in an ongoing way so that when you do go to capture your time, you need to have a system so you know what to be writing down. So it may be that you're procrastinating because you don't want to do this thing. And yet it's a sign that there's other things that are missing, right? It might be putting off planning or sitting down to the file where you're going to delegate because there's items in there that you're going to have to come face to face with. And so I'd invite you to think about areas in your practice where you may be procrastinating where the issue isn't so much, can I sit down and force myself to do my timesheets? It's, what do I need to be doing differently in order to not have this problem of procrastination? And I think there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is from a systems perspective. It really may be that there are systems that you could adopt that would make for a more streamlined and efficient practice. Sometimes it's also just support. If you find that you put off invoicing, and let's say you're a sole practitioner, maybe you don't have a dedicated person to help you with that. It may be that it's time for you to get more help, an assistant who can help you with those types of tasks. If you're in a larger organization or a law firm and the support is available and you're just not using it, then maybe it's time to start developing systems where you're relying more on others to support you in your work. So those were some examples. I'll just recap them once again. If you were in my live audience, I would ask you, which of these resonates with you? And so just to recap, nature of the work, is it an alignment question? Burnout, are you feeling like the situational stressors or high periods are no longer situational? Are you receiving instructions from clients that maybe you don't entirely agree with or that are simply not sustainable for you in terms of volume? Are you struggling with self-confidence? Have you had challenges when it comes to developing that relationship of self-trust? Is that where you maybe want to spend some time? Money mindset. Are there thoughts and beliefs about money and about value that are holding you back from executing on certain tasks in your practice that are necessary to move it forward? Or practice management. That was the last one that I mentioned. Are there some challenges there that if you were to solve for those, the practice or the procrastination would no longer be an issue? Now, when you do this, when you look at procrastination for what it is, you focus on what might be the underlying problem as opposed to the discrete task or area where you find yourself procrastinating, what you might find there is that it works because you get a more wholesale look at what is going on with you. And what it invites you to do is to listen to procrastination. So we're not fighting against it. We're not saying it's bad. We're not saying we're bad because we procrastinate. You're looking at it from a very curious perspective and you are asking yourself, what is this procrastination trying to tell me? And you're able to then figure out what the root cause is. And that gives you greater insight. Now you have information that gives you power. You know what you need to change. Now, in order to do this, in order to implement this or to really do that deep dive, you can do this. You don't need a ton of skills. Number one, you need to stop judging yourself. So if you're like most of us and you're procrastinating, you might then beat yourself up. You might go so far as to call yourself lazy. Please don't do that. You're not lazy. This is so normal. We all do it. You're not alone. You're not undisciplined. You're not flawed. None of those creative labels apply to you. And so step number one is to just simply stop judging yourself and to take a step back and look at the problem, look at the question from a place of curiosity as opposed to self-judgment. Now, the second skill that you will need, there are 4 altogether that I have here, is to pay attention to where you procrastinate. So if you've gone through this entire episode and you've been thinking about what's happening in your practice, already you've started to notice areas where you're procrastinating. And so I invite you to pay greater attention to those areas. The third skill you're going to need, and this is a tough one, is to be honest with yourself. If you're procrastinating, chances are you're not doing this because you're not smart or because you want to do this to yourself. Often what is behind the scenes might require that you make a really difficult decision. If you are out of alignment with your work and you're in a workplace where you love the people, you love the environment, you love the stability, and what you're realizing is that you're no longer aligned, and that means that you're going to have to break away from something really predictable and secure and a place where you thought you wanted to be forever maybe, and you're going to have to do something different. That in itself is a really difficult decision to make. And so no wonder you're procrastinating, right? There's no judgment there. It's totally normal. And so what I'd invite you to do here is to be honest with yourself and to think about what is it that's really going on here? And again, to have grace with yourself. And then finally, the last skill that you'll need is a willingness to make changes, even when they are difficult. And this is a really tough one, right? Is making a difficult decision where you're inviting that discomfort in the short term. Let's say it is leaving your job, right? Or let's say it's money mindset. You have a lot of difficulty when it comes to invoicing, and you're going to need to develop a new practice where maybe what happens is you're having really upfront discussions with your clients at the very beginning about money. That might be really uncomfortable for you. And so you're going to need to take on that initial discomfort, that short-term discomfort of having that conversation up front, which I assure you is going to give you all sorts of useful information, and it's going to help manage your clients' expectations, but you're going to have it. It's going to feel difficult in the moment, but then you are staving off or potentially avoiding altogether a different form of discomfort down the road where you haven't laid that clear groundwork, where now you're dealing with a different problem, which might be one of writing off all of your time or a good chunk of your time or having a difficult conversation down the road. So what I'm inviting you to do here is to be willing to make changes on purpose, even when they're difficult. So here you're engaging in that short-term discomfort in exchange for avoiding that longer-term discomfort. Now, what will happen when you address that underlying problem, the one that is creating procrastination, what you'll find is that you'll have less procrastination, right? Hopefully, going back to that initial range, that spectrum, if you were at a 75% procrastination rate and you're able to bring yourself to a 25% procrastination rate, now you've got a problem that you can manage as opposed to a problem that you need to solve. And your overall experience of your professional work will be so much better. If you can have 25% versus 75%, it speaks for itself. And so I invite all of you to reflect on what we've talked about here today, what I've shared with you, how it applies to your practice, and I love takeaways, what you will apply in your practice going forward. And so thank you to all of you who've tuned in today. Thank you again to the Advocate Society for inviting me to speak yesterday. It was such a delight. It was such a pleasure. It was so nice to be in person in a room and to see the engagement, to hear the questions, to hear the takeaways. It was such a wonderful experience and such a wonderful reminder that we're all in this together. So whether we are together in a virtual sense or an in-person sense, thank you so much for being part of this community. If you have questions, if you are interested in working with me, I continue to do one-to-one coaching. And my wheels are turning in terms of doing another group program. I've mentioned on the podcast before, I currently have a group of incredible women lawyers where there are 8 altogether, and we wrap up at the end of June. And I'm increasingly convinced that I want to do more of this. It's such an amazing experience for everybody. And so I'd invite you to send me a note if that's something that is of interest to you. So more on that later. Stay tuned. And for all of you, thanks again for joining me, and have a wonderful, wonderful week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.